Welcome to this event, which is part of the COVID-19 Advancing Rights and Justice During a Pandemic event series that is convened by the Columbia Law School Human Rights Institute, Duke Law's International Human Rights Clinic, Columbia Law's Center for Gender and Sexuality Law, and Just Security. My name is Maya Alkateb-Chami. I'm the Managing Director of the Human Rights Institute at Columbia Law and will be moderating this event. Zoom seems to be overwhelmed at the moment, so if the video is choppy, please know it's not your devices. Please bear with us. We're hoping that the audio will be fine throughout this event. The impact of COVID-19 on education is tangibly felt across the globe. With school closures, disparities in access to remote education, disruption to free meal and vaccine programs, risk of increased dropout rates, and more. While there have been sounding alarms about these challenges, there is worryingly little about strategies and remedies so that the right to education is protected for all children. It is exactly because of this that we curated this program. We will hear today from Elin Martínez of Human Rights Watch, who is an expert in children's rights and the right to education, Helen Abadzi, an expert in cognitive psychology and learning and a former World Bank education specialist for 27 years, and Gustavo Payan of DAI, whose work focuses on education in fragile states and who co-chairs the advocacy working group at the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, or INEE. We will start with presentations by our panelists, followed by Q&A. Audience members are invited to submit your questions via the Q&A function of Zoom at the bottom of your screen, or via Twitter using the hashtag COVID-19Justice. Ellen, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Maya, and good morning or good afternoon to those of you who have joined. And just to say it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. In the interest of time, I'm just going to jump right into the issues that I'm going to be discussing. And those are threefold. One is to give you an overview of the right to education in a nutshell, and to weave that into with challenges that we're seeing with regards to education and COVID-19. And finally, perhaps also in the discussion, how to address the challenges in a rights way, in a rights compliant way in particular. Now, it's very safe to say that this is a really unprecedented crisis. I mean, over 1.5 billion students have been affected by pandemic-related school closures. And so that includes children officially in education in preschool, primary, secondary, and higher education. For the most part, I'm going to focus on primary and secondary school going children who represent the overwhelming majority of students affected and who have already been affected by many other challenges because of their context or the status or their status. And I should say the warning now is that for many of these children, their education paths are at great risk if the right measures aren't adopted right now as the crisis unfolds and in the aftermath. Now, I should say I will be sharing some links to the different materials that I will talk about, and particularly one of those is the handbook by UNESCO and the Right to Education Initiative that sets out all the aspects of the right to education. But we'll come to that as well in the discussion. Now, the right to education, as many of you know, is a fundamental human right and one that we find in almost every international human rights treaty. Of course, most of us are guided by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most universally ratified treaty, except of course for one country, the United States. But the CRC, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, really sets out the framework and the lens through which we should be looking at children's rights and education in particular through the COVID lens. Of course, it protects a series of things. I will focus on a few fold. For one, it protects the right to free and compulsory education and the right to secondary education and makes it available and accessible to all on a progressive basis. But of course, it also protects the right to higher education subject to available resources. At Human Rights Watch, we actually have spent a lot of time looking at the right to secondary education, and we actually feel that right should be immediately realizable, because it has been a right that has been in existence since the 70s. Most children need the right to secondary education in order to progress in life along their own education journeys. So as we think about this crisis, we also think about not just primary school children or the youngest children, but particularly teenagers who need to be in school as well. There are a number of components, of course, that are crucial, including in this emergency and this crisis. Of course, non-discrimination, which applies to all groups and should be the guiding lens as we think through the crisis and in this discussion. So children with disabilities, refugee children, minority and indigenous groups, obviously girls, and I should say there are obviously treaties that provide further protections for these particular groups of children, but again, the CRC covers all of them. In the right to education, we often talk about access because it's a clear indicator of something very visible, but of course, core to the right to education is quality, and I'm sure Helen will guide us a lot through this. But particularly the focus is on what children will get out of their education. And so the aims of education are crucial. Education needs to provide children with life skills. It needs to ensure that children's capacity is greatly built so that they can enjoy a full range of human rights. And it should particularly ensure that children's education is grounded in human dignity, building their self-esteem, self-confidence. And crucially these days, given all the crises that are happening and the way that the world is also changing, resilience. Now, as we see in this emergency and we see in other crises, education is a fundamental right and so not subject to derogation. So governments must uphold the right to education in all circumstances, even in a state of emergency, including in humanitarian emergencies that Gustavo will talk about as well. And the reason why that is because education provides life-saving and life-sustaining spaces for children, and it provides a continuity for them so that after the crisis, children can continue to study, but also move on and not be as affected by emergencies. Now, this is a really crucial piece. As with all human rights, governments are fundamentally responsible for safeguarding and realizing every children's right to education. So governments cannot see their obligations to private actors or tech companies or any other actors that seek to provide education in certain contexts. And as we speak today, I'm very conscious, and I've heard this on and on in many different panels that I've tuned into. I've heard many government leaders, UN agency directors and others increasingly call on the private sector to play a major role in advancing education goals and supporting governments in this response, particularly the tech sector. And many human rights experts have worked for many years to ensure that there is some form of regulation around private actors in education. And this crisis, and so sorry, I should say they have adopted the Abidjan principles, and I will link to it so that you can take a look. This provides guidance on how actors should interact in education. In this crisis, we're seeing many tech companies stepping in to provide space for key learning platforms and other materials for teachers and government officials. And yet governments have the prime responsibility to ensure that children and teachers' data and privacy is fully protected. And so we're seeing emerging gaps as well. I hope that we can come to that in the discussion. Now, governments need to allocate adequate resources to realize every children's right to education. And so we speak about available resources, but at a minimum, UNESCO has set global benchmarks of how much governments need to be spending, and that's at least 20% of their public budgets or 4% of their gross domestic products, or GDPs. Now, what we're seeing right now, and we've seen the parallel in health, is that many governments have slashed their education budgets in some occasions because of austerity measures. A lot of governments have still not recovered or ensured that their education budgets match their ambitions. And so that's what's driving many education inequalities that we're seeing at the moment. And it's something to look at very closely as the situation evolves related to COVID-19, because we can foresee many more cuts coming up, and many of those will not be will actually be to the detriment of human rights, including the right to education. Now, finally, I think closing on this nutshell, that it hasn't been so much of a nutshell, but an overview. We should remember that schools aren't just places of official learning. In fact, now we can see that now that schools are closed, many children are missing out on accessing protective spaces. Children are also likely not getting the psychosocial support or protective measures they really need to compensate for what's happening at home. Particularly when we hear about reports of that domestic violence is increasing, we can for sure expect that children will be exposed to that as well. And yet they're not given the additional support that they would often get in schools. A shocking number of children also currently depend on schools for their only hot meal of the day. This is the case in the US, in the UK where I'm based, but also in many countries around the world. And while governments have done a mix of things to try to provide this in the crisis, many children are still going hungry, and this has by no means been solved. Now this matters right now, and we really need to discuss it because these are things that governments need to be fixing and will need to ensure that there are additional measures in place as children go back to school to redress all of these different gaps in what children are experiencing. Now, earlier on, I referred to 1.5 billion students being affected by school closures, but I would actually be remiss if I didn't mention that this is on top. I mean, so there are over 260 million children and adolescents who were already out of school before the pandemic hit. So I mean, it is a much bigger group of children who are affected, and in fact, many of them who have not been counted in official data. So because of this crisis, and based on other similar crises we've seen in the past, we can expect that the out-of-school figure will go up and that there will be far more children at risk, particularly because of the financial and socioeconomic barriers that many families will likely face in the aftermath of the crisis, and the fact that many parents will not be able to invest in their children's education in the same way that they have until now. Now, I know I'm quickly running out of my 10 minutes, so I'll go for this very quickly, but I hope to come back to it. Right now, we're seeing that most interventions by governments to respond to COVID-19 are still targeting the average students. So that's a student with a parent who can follow online or semi-offline learning and has the time to do so. A child who has a steady internet connection or specific time to sit down and study in the cases of offline learning. And also children who have access to equipment or textbooks to continue studying. Now, from all of the research that I have done and the many hundreds of children I have interviewed at my time at Human Rights Watch, that's, I mean, certainly by no means the average student. And so it's the kind of child that will be missing out greatly. And so the guiding principle that we will discuss today, but also moving forward, should be about full inclusion and not just reaching the average child. So what does that mean? That really means focusing right now on children who are at great risk, so children without internet devices or methods to continue offline learning, whatever method is in place in their countries, children with disabilities who are by no means being reached through online platforms, and for the most part actually have been often considered an afterthought in many of the government responses I have been monitoring. Refugee or migrant children whose parents may not be able to follow the same instructions or understand the instructions given by schools, and many girls in certain contexts who are probably not able to dedicate as much time to studying because they have household or other caregiving responsibilities that overwhelmingly fall on them. Now, governments should be looking at basic measures to ensure all children are provided with materials. So we know that teachers or school principals will be looking at who is the most at-risk child and trying to provide, but they may not have the resources because central governments may not have dedicated or sent those resources to teachers who may well be paying out of pocket. So that needs to be taken care of. They should also be reaching out to, oh, Maya, I can see, yeah.
I'm sure we'll have some more time in a discussion, but if.
Sure. I'll just wrap up very briefly. I mean, you know, again, like here, the context is reaching out to communities that are most vulnerable and particularly trying to work with parents and those communities to ensure that all of the investments they have made and all of the platforms they have made to protect children's right to education remains, but that they're also being, empowered, given the fact that given that schools are closed, the attention goes back to the community and the individual family to ensure that they uphold the right to education during this context. I'll come back to other things in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Helen, please go ahead. You're on mute. There seems to be a delay in unmuting. Oh.
Hear me, okay?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, share screen and the audio. Do you see me now? And do you see the PowerPoint file?
Excellent.
Okay, it's been a great introduction and goes right into the issues of what can be done when we have students suddenly quitting and running away from homes and schools, which have been the refugee experiences. And the COVID-19 school closures are like that, except that children, get to keep their books as they were at school, rather than have to flee without their textbooks, which I'm sure a lot of children did in their various refugee situations. I wanted to start you an example of what matters really about quality. What we hear thus far is access, and of course all the access, the humanitarian stuff. Later we're going to hear also about the socio-emotional. That's great, but that is quality. Can we define it better? If for the listeners who are advocates of children's rights, you need to focus on how the brain acquires education. And I will do my best to give you cognitive psychology of that in 10 minutes and show you something. To give you an example, the Rohingya conflict has been widely played in the media, but it boils down to these scripts. The children either would have to learn Burmese to the left or Bengali to the right. Now, if you all think this is gibberish, imagine that tens of millions in Burma and at least 140 million people in Bengali see this as clearly as you see English, instantly, fluently. I only know Bengali, I don't get no Burmese. The thing is, they are not compatible scripts. You cannot go from one to the other, and it takes a lot of time to learn letter by letter those squiggles that you see on one side versus the squiggles that you see on the other side, and to get to the point of practice to automatize and clearly see them as clearly and effortlessly as you see English. So how do we do this fastest? I talk a lot about these things, but the point is that the refugees suddenly, they may have been on the process of learning one, and then suddenly have to say, and now you have to start all over on the other, or not start at all. This is what we see with refugees, but also in this particular case, children in Senegal are finally managing to get enough French or to get, to start reading Houghton Wolof, and boom, the school's closed. What's going to happen to the brain when that does? So I'll try memory principles in 5 minutes for child's right advocates. One thing to start with, understand quality. Our knowledge really is organized in networks, and by now the neuroscience kind of finds them in your brain in a weird way. And it's the networks are bunches of neurons that light up together at one particular moment, and other permutations would light up another, but they create all of these complex concepts that we see, including, of course, the detection of letter shapes, as in Bangla in Burmese that you saw earlier. You cannot do it unless you have tons of collected knowledge that actually gets retrieved instantly into the space in your brain that you have right now in order to make decisions. In a way, we can say that memory networks are built like bricks and mortar. So you can think of teaching. It's like a construction business. Children have to learn bit by bit, letter by letter, calculation by calculation, process by process, with tons of practice. You need time and materials for the job. That is textbooks, instructional time. And of course, the teachers need to know how to lay these walls. And by the way, don't think that all we need is creativity and good fun and all that. It's like trying to build the second floor without the first. It's not, you know, in the Earth's gravity, this is not possible. I have to cut very fast into the phenomena. Practice really speeds up retrieval. And at some moment, after trying to do this consciously with effort, we start executing fast and automatically. And then that fast and automatic execution is more resilient to forgetting. Schools close, you run away from Syria or Afghanistan or whatever, the brain starts forgetting. But if you know already a lot, if you are proficient reader, let's say, proficient calculator, you don't easily forget. In fact, the more you know, the less you forget. The research shows that we see now, is what is relevant now, is research returning the summer break of the poor. They lose like, you know, half a class, whereas the well-to-do don't lose because they get to practice, they knew more to begin with. So very quickly, within the last 1 or 2 days, you start losing numbers of items that you could retrieve. And then it kind of slows down. Learning goes this way, forgetting goes that way also. The more you know, the less you forget. The child's advocates need to make sure that the children have these dense cognitive memory networks in their brains. Because what we see is this, performance. The schools of the poor, their children have poor little networks that have nothing, very little in there. They're sparse, they're not well connected. By contrast, the schools of the better off, they're well connected, they're higher order concepts already, and they will forget less and they will perform much better. This is, by the way, unfortunately, the division between the haves and have-nots, basically from grade 1, day 1, and over time it diverges. The question in this particular case, very much like the question of the refugees, is can we do something better? And for you, there are some solutions. And I want to continue explaining this because it's not just learning, you know, getting your memory networks, of which, of course, you all have very dense and very complex networks that produce, you know, retrieval in milliseconds. All of this hits against a very narrow tunnel that all the information is passed through. Memory is like the biggest bottle in the world. The long-term memory holds these memory networks that I showed you. But to enter the long-term memory, you have a very, very narrow neck that holds about 7 items, let's say, of simple text for about 12 seconds. It's called working memory. And it's what is in your mind right now. So stuff needs to be processed very fast. Then it'll go and find its way. If something you hear gets processed lost, it'll get lost. So the implication of this is that we need to process very fast because we want items to be found and right into memory networks, and of course to come out of memory networks just as fast in order for you to use them. I don't want to bother you too much with the specifics, but that has implications. A minimum reading speed to make sense of text is something like 45 to 60 words per minute, probably in all languages and scripts because the brain processes this kind of information in very similar ways. So don't let, you know, the looks of Burmese or Chinese mislead you. And comprehension comes later. It sounds, again, very kind of prosaic or, you know, mechanical. You need to watch for words per minute, and you can hear it. Can you answer, Lillian, can you start the video? I want to show you a refugee child from Lebanon, Syria, grade 3, how halting reading sounds.
Yeah. And Helen, I'm mindful of the time, so you had shared that you wanted to show 2 videos. Maybe we can select one of them.
I don't know, because I sent that one. I can certainly try, or not. Can you? Okay. It's just a few seconds anyway.
طيب وأجوب غني الحروف.
Stop. Okay. The point about this video, and can, you know, I need to return to screen sharing. Let's see. The point about this video, there's no time to train you to listen. A third grader cannot be reading this slowly. She cannot make sense of text even if she knows enough standard Arabic. It takes too long. You all can listen to the students read. If they sound quote unquote natural, like natural speech, then they're pretty much making sense. If not, they're not. They really, in all languages and scripts, including problematic Arabic, by the end of grades 2, they should attain those 45 to 60 words per minute. What we will be seeing, however, is that due to the school closures, particularly those poorer students with those few loose networks and very limited practice, will be performing maybe 5, 10, who knows, 0 words per minute, who knows. The well-to-do, they'll have no problem. Right now, they're sitting at home with their computers logged on, you know, with sufficient bandwidth. They'll get better and better. And this is where the child advocates and the rights advocates need to matter. For math, we have the same thing. We really need about 20 single-digit operations correct per minute from grades 1 to 3. More than 40 of these. Like if I gave you a whole list of stuff of these, or even 3 or 4 digit numbers to add and multiply for things, you need to know the operations, and then you need to know them fast. Fast because working memory has no space. It's getting wiped out. And we understand a lot worldwide, by the end of grade 3, you want the students proficient in adding and subtracting whole numbers. By the end of grade 5, multiplying and dividing. By the end of grade 6, mastery of multiplication. And you want proficiency, not just general knowledge. The material needs to come instantly, effortlessly into your working memory. So I won't show this video, but which is very short, but this is what they are. We're looking at 4th grader, Syrian refugees, and we're asking 34 times 6, you know, divided into 6. And the child doesn't quite know what to do. That's what you're likely to see. These are the displays of quality. We can get and we are very specific. The point about recovering education without widening the rich-poor gap, I'm afraid it's not quite possible because the brain works the way it does. The gap is, you know, basically between the students we get more versus less instructional time and practice, and of course materials. And it's probably inevitable. You, as rights advocates, you need to actually demand performance and actual skills, not just, you know, we want the children to be in participatory classes with interesting stuff and fun and enjoy these things. No, you need to get these automatic performances. And by the way, for secondary school, it's the same thing. How fast can you solve algebra equations? Not just how generally you know the stuff, but how fast can you do it? Skills and practice, by the way, requires textbooks in languages and scripts that you already know. So back to the Rohingya refugees, we give you, the child never learned Burmese, goes to Burma, speaks Burmese, but can't read those squiggles. So the usual standards and efforts are too general. They often lead to failure. You, hopefully, the people who are involved want to see performance and be able to explain why. By the way, you can all come back to me individually. I do extensive training and have extensive work to explain why. Because one, unfortunately, is also likely to hear, oh, these things don't really matter. They're low level, they're mechanical. We want the children to be happy, to understand, you know, all that kind of stuff. It's very nice, but you've got to be automatic and fluent in all of these skills in order then to get ahead. And then when the question is, do the children have the right to become fluent and automatic in basic skills? So I leave everyone to consider that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Elin and Helen, for setting the stage for my presentation. I think it's fascinating, and wish we had more time. I'll briefly, I wear 2 hats, and I'll be talking about those two hats. One is I work for DAI implementing a USAID and UNICEF funded project in Honduras that promotes safe learning environments. But I also represent DAI at the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, INEE, which developed and disseminates the minimum standards for education in emergencies. So I'll be talking a little bit about both. So I'll get started. I'm conscious of time. I'll try and go quickly. So I'll touch very briefly on some of these issues. So to begin with, INEE, the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, is an open global network of members that work together in the humanitarian development spaces to ensure that individuals have the right to quality, safe, relevant, and equitable education. And it's completely founded on the fundamental right to education, as Ellen was explaining earlier. What it means for me, for example, as a member of one of the working groups, is that we're able to share a lot of not only good practices, but also try and move the field and the sector of education emergencies forward. And I think it has never been more important than right now when, as Ellen described, there's an emergency that is affecting the whole world. So it's not only about fragile states or about conflict-affected countries or about mass displacement. This is affecting the whole world. And it's an important resource that I want to share with everybody. So one of the things that I mentioned are the minimum standards, which were developed and released 10 years ago. So there's the need for an update, and that'll happen soon. So we welcome input from everybody on how to improve these minimum standards for education emergencies. And I'll share briefly, let me see if I can master this. I think you should be seeing the map of the minimum standards for education emergencies. It's a set of standards organized in 5 different domains. And there's 19, and each of the different standards come with different key actions and guidance notes. Now, as any document, as any policy, as any program, is not perfect, but it has definitely helped governments and organizations think about some of the aspects of education in emergencies in terms of preparedness, response, and recovery that sometimes we can easily forget. So I'll be sharing the links. I won't go into more detail because I'm cognizant of time, and I'll stop, but that's sort of the map of the minimum standards. And there are many other resources that INEE is right now working on in relation to COVID, which is what brings us together. And I'm going to share I'll share the link as well. So many resources. There's a technical note, advocacy messages, advocacy briefs, webinars, blogs, newsletters, measurement tools, discussions around that. There's a technical note that uses the minimum standards as a framework to have a discussion and help governments think about the challenges that education systems are facing and what to prioritize. So for instance, Elin was talking about the importance of psychosocial support and well-being as precursors to learning, right? And that is something that sometimes we find is put in the back burner. And so the technical note helps governments think about what are some of the critical steps to ensure access and to some degree quality as well. So I'm gonna stop there with INEE. So this is I'm cutting down my time so we have some time for discussion. And Maya also asked me to talk about my experience as a practitioner and our work in Honduras specifically, which is a country that has been largely affected and not necessarily formally recognized as a crisis and conflict affected state. But given the levels of violence and crime it's definitely a country where education has been extremely affected, not only in terms of quality, as Helen was describing, but also access and many other education outcomes. Asegurando la Educación is the name of my project, which is in Spanish for security in education. It's, I mentioned already, is supported by USAID and UNICEF. It works in 5 different cities in Honduras affected by the highest levels of violence and crime. So we work in 135 schools in some of the communities most affected by violence. And our main goal is to promote a safe learning environment where children can then access, stay in school and learn. We don't focus on the academic aspect of it. We focus on the environment and safety and inclusive environments. I'll share briefly our approach. Sort of is a little of a map or a framework, we call it Peacock, that talks about all the different programs that happen in a given school, up to the different 14 different types of programs, because we have found that to change the school environment, you have to definitely work with all school actors. It's not only targeting children or learners, not only targeting teachers, but you really have to work with everybody. So there's, and have some base of evidence as to what are some of the most pressing issues. Each school is a different ecosystem. So we can talk about contexts like, you know, Latin America, and then we can narrow down to Central America and then Honduras. But the reality is La Ceiba city in northern Honduras is very different to the capital city, Tegucigalpa. And even within La Ceiba, you face different challenges because you may be in a community that is affected by gang violence, whereas there may be other where is the path for drug trafficking. And so the specifics of each community and each school are different. And so the ecosystem is different, but also the strengths and the assets that are available. There may be a church in the community. And so we try to, or different social protection actors, and we try to ensure that schools then work with their existing or potential partners in social protection, so that schools don't operate individually or isolated, which often happens when the social contract is fragmented and when the social fabric is so damaged. And so we work with all the school actors, but we also work with the communities and social protection actors, facilitating a process where they connect. This could be the police, but this could be the national emergency system, the 911, which is something that we're doing right now in the context of what Elin was describing in the rise of child abuse and domestic violence. An important approach has been infusing a lot of social emotional learning, psychosocial support, and well-being, again, as a foundation to ensure that some of the expected outcomes are achieved in terms of access, enrollment, etc. We are an education and crisis and conflict project. We have mostly focused on violence and how violence affects schools and how they can get agency to act, but also data and some other tools. But we have been working as well with the more recent challenges related to migration and displacement. So this new crisis that affects us all now, the COVID-19 pandemic is really no different, but we've had to make a lot of adjustments in terms of the way we deliver, obviously, some of our programming and what we focus on given the constraints. So most of our, I'm gonna stop sharing. Most of our program has been now geared towards promoting well-being. I'm going to tell an anecdote and then go to the concluding remarks. So talking to the Vice Minister, which is our counterpart and really who leads all the technical work, Honduras has prioritized, because it typically falls in the lower, at the end of the list in the PISA results, has prioritized math, Spanish, and other sort of basic skills. Not to a huge success, but that's been the priority, putting aside other aspects that I've been talking about that relate to inclusive and safety and protection. And that the Ministry of Education let us do our thing in a way, but with this pandemic now and sharing some of the INEE resources, there's a realization that these are actually important issues that should be prioritized as well, because there was a pushback from many teachers who were facing the challenges that some of Elin and Helen were describing in terms of access to technology and how to deliver content in a way that is that ensures quality. And the levels of stress, toxic stress, anxiety was just a ticking bomb. So promoting well-being for teachers has been a priority for us. You know, ensuring that principals understand and redefine their role in the context of this pandemic. Understand that there are underlying challenges that will only get exacerbated if we don't do something about it in the current times. So that's been a way that we're sort of adjusting our programming. I won't share the last screen that I was going to share with some of our programs on YouTube, recognizing that this is not necessarily accessing everybody, but thinking of how do we develop a multimodal approach where we deliver WhatsApp, you know, texts, materials, and some of the challenges that Helen was referring to. So I'm going to conclude with 3 remarks. One is, I said already, a crisis like this will exacerbate and amplify some of the challenges if we don't do something about it. So the exclusion that Ellen was talking about, you know, for minority groups, for girls, for students with disabilities, is only going to get worse if we don't do something about it. We know that we're in this period of chaos and disequilibrium, and we're maybe confused. We're trying to make sense of things and get organized. So this is the perfect opportunity to redefine education and think about the topic of this webinar. How do we rebound from this? How do we become resilient and bounce back with more, with a new concept of what education should look like? And I'm talking about maybe using different metrics to measure, reprioritizing some of the things that we have prioritized in the past, and thinking what really matters. How can we deliver education? How can we be more accessible? How can we deliver more quality? And the last thing is we should prioritize and work very closely in the education sector with mental health, and it's just a fundamental aspect of the work. So I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. A quick reminder to our audience members to use hashtag COVID-19 Justice for questions, or the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'm going to ask a question along with seeing if any panelists would like to comment on what each other said. So it's interesting that 2 weeks ago, there was a court decision for the first time in US history, mandating that children have a fundamental right to a minimum education that provides basic literacy. These are obviously children who are already going to school in the US, but the court ruled that the basic literacy, you know, specified that basic literacy is now required. Do you think it would be useful to unpack the right to education to its building blocks and do advocacy around these rather than for a blanket right to education? Not necessarily you're advocating the, you know, for basic literacy specifically, but I wonder how you would react to this in general.
Can I answer?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Obviously, the right to education does mean at the very least basic literacy. And incidentally, numeracy is innate in the brain. People who are not trained in operations are not very good at making complex calculations. But numeracy of small numbers, frogs can do. The basic literacy definitely is the case. And I showed you quickly, you can't just be able to know your letters and do it one by one. You run out of, by the end of the sentence, you're out from remembering what the beginning was because of the working memory restrictions. You actually need to attain automaticity. And by the way, the minimum standards ought to be taking up all of this new research. We really ought to be looking to like 60 words per minute, which is very inadequate for a long text. But you can read a letter that your uncle, for example, has died and please go to the funeral. In the US, we have the specific problem of English, which is complex and can leave many people illiterate, particularly the way big chunks are being taught early. For the low-income countries where transparent orthographies are used, what you read is what you write, because of very limited instruction and lack of textbooks, the children may not know them. So it's a good international standards that the right to education means, and I would like to say that 60 words per minute for all. Thank you. And yes, you should be focusing on that. That is, anybody who's a rights watch person, you actually need to go to the classrooms. And that's how I made my infamous career in the World Bank. I would go and find out that the students didn't read. So do you hear them read rationally? You can count if they have 60 words per minute. You can actually reasonably say, does this sound like, you know, reasonably fluent speech? Everyone can tell them. Thank you.
Elin, Gustavo?
So, I mean, it is, I mean, I agree with Helen. I mean, as a researcher for Human Rights Watch, I often spend quite a bit of time interviewing children and teachers, and I'm in classrooms, and I often, you know, can see how children use different languages, or perhaps are not able to communicate in the dominant language that is proposed at a national level. So I'm fully in agreement with her. On the right to literacy, or the right to, I mean, I often say the right to learn. I mean, the right to literacy is one of the narrow aspects of the right to education, but of course, all children should be in schools and should be able to follow. And that imposes, again, you know, going back to the idea that governments need to guarantee not just that you have children sitting in classrooms and so are counted in from a perspective of access, but that education actually means something to them and is a means for them to navigate the rest of what's happening around them, right? And so if they're not able to read very basic things, but also then, you know, have that fundamental sort of ability to read in order to then proceed with other subjects, then, you know, governments are obviously not doing the right thing. Now, on Gustavo's point, that also requires a focus on teachers and empowering teachers and providing teachers with the training. I think most often teachers are doing an incredible amount of work without the resources, often, as I said, taking it out of their own pockets. And so beyond just counting on indicators and literacy, like what actually is happening in the school context to empower everyone around it to ensure that children are able to read, write, and interact in other ways. I think that's what matters.
Elin and Helen, you both emphasized the importance of quality and not just focusing on students having access or dropout rates and so forth. What are some resources and tactics that we have and can draw on locally and internationally to hold states accountable to providing the right to education that our children deserve?
If I may say, worldwide, there is an early grade reading assessment that has been financed by USAID and of course taken up by many international NGOs. And I won't get into the long debates of all this. It has one test of a 1 minute paragraph that children ought to be reading at 60 words per minute. And we're talking about grade 2. It's still great. What we find is 5, 6, 7, you know, they can't read that. It's the right to reading automaticity, very specifically, that enables you to understand if you know the language. Interestingly, you can do that and not know the language. That's a different thing. Strangely, language is easier to learn. Reading automaticity requires large and spaced letters, tons of practice, big textbooks with at least 5,000 to 10,000 words, not big pictures and interesting and cute stuff. But I understand when Ellen says this sounds, you know, narrow and we want bigger. Unless you attain that narrow, you cannot get bigger. You cannot become broader. So again, you all can do this. The road to learning relevant material, not just what your girlfriend was wearing yesterday. You learned that too. The right to learning relevant material goes through reading automaticity, and I would also say math automaticity. Mental math, it's a different story. It's easier again to test, but it's the reading automaticity that really matters. If you're a fluent reader, even if you don't know a language, the language is easier to learn than to attain those 60 words per minute.
Clear from Helen.
Big thing.
Yeah,
big thing. The COVID and the refugees mean that thousands of students today will remain illiterate We only can teach, we only can attain reading automaticity reasonably until like age 18. After 19, we all become dyslexics for new scripts. And we have plenty of reason. We need to stop a tsunami of adult illiteracy that's coming.
Thanks, Helen, for this strong advocacy message. Any other tactics or ways or things that not only, that advocates and lawyers could do, but also we have a question from a retired teacher who's saying, how can I be active and help? So if you could answer more broadly as well.
You're asking me? Okay.
The other panelists have comments first, and then we see.
Yeah. Just going to briefly chime in, going back to your question about the accountability. And I think there's no straight answer, but we have to keep working collectively and find the shared agenda. And I think even this panel shows how we see things from different perspectives. And I think we have to find common ground in order to move forward, or else we're going to spin wheels, and that often happens not only in education but in other sectors as well. And so I think finding the shared agenda for those of us advocating and promoting, or as practitioners, advocates, researchers, in whatever role is, retired teachers, and that shared agenda, so that we can then advocate at a higher level and put more pressure, because we know that the conventions are important, the adjunct principles, the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, in terms of the Safe School Declaration. Those are important measures, but it's not enough. And we have to do both top down and bottom up. And how do we equip folks who are in the trenches, right, in the schools, teachers, but also practitioners and students and learners and families to advocate and manage up. But I don't think there's a magic formula for that.
Permit me, and I apologize because I started asking the answer, the simple way for accountability, because it does exist. The early grade reading assessment, at least one subtest of the connected text. It's been done in at least 70 countries, 80 countries by now. And yes, it can be done quickly, and governments can be, quote unquote, held accountable. Now, governments get a lot of fuzzy advice, and government officials don't know who to believe. Do they believe me? And someone says, but this woman is just saying narrow stuff. We want the children to be creative. Do they believe someone else? These decisions, people aren't sure what to do. But yes, there is. The early grade reading assessment is a worldwide test that is internationally comparable, because that's the way the memory works. Thank you. By the way, the pearls that are given in grade 4. And we have a lot of international data on that. So we do have an answer to these things. The point is, you practitioners, need to be able to say, where can I get the best advice? What do I see? Where can I get the best advice?
Ellen?
A little bit of that.
So, I mean, accountability for human rights is like the bread and butter of every person at Human Rights Watch. And so we do that through, obviously, research and then advocacy. Now, Maya, I think in this type of situation, as I mentioned in my presentation, I mean, the onus and the burden is currently on parents and communities, right, to continue to ensure that children can access education. And I think this is something that all of us should be building on, because we have mobilized a great group of parents globally, not just in countries that are often affected by emergencies or crises, as Gustavo said. And they now know how crucial and how much work happens and goes into ensuring that children have education. So by all means, tapping into parents and communities as key resources in their own advocacy, but also continuing to monitor what governments are doing. And so that's not just Human Rights Watch, that's many colleagues on this call, that's many students who are part of the different institutes that have sponsored this webinar, to say actually sort of which groups of children continue to miss out, drop out or are excluded effectively because of government policies, which schools are not targeting children in the right way, why are certain things not happening at the moment, and continuing to call that out. But particularly trying to find information, trying to, inform the discussion based on facts and things that we're seeing, including from our own children or children that we know of, and engaging in that way. for us, what's really crucial right now is that because this crisis is going to happen for a long time and the aftermath will have huge knock-on effects, that governments, but also, so civil society actors and others are really transparent about those blockages and barriers, and that they provide ample space for civil society to engage in how to build back better education systems, which is the term that we're currently seeing. Maya, if I may just say something, because there was a question in the chat around COVID-19 and how do we balance out the right to education in line with the sort of responsibility on public health grounds. Can I just answer that?
Question, yes.
Yeah. So, in my presentation, I talked about education being a fundamental right. I used the word subject to non-derogation. I know human rights lawyers will want to dispute me on this, but for the public audience, it was much more about actually, it is so fundamental that it is subject to very few limitations. And as an economic, social, and cultural right, those limitations need to be proportional and so much to guarantee the general welfare in a democratic society is a term that the committee that oversees this treaty says. And so it needs to be, the least restrictive alternative. So if a government is going to restrict the right to education, it needs to be the least restrictive method or alternative. Now, in this case, public health obviously trumps all other aspects, because we don't want children, teachers, or caregivers and other education staff to get ill as well, and then obviously augment the number of people who are affected. And so those considerations are really crucial. However, what this crisis has really shown us is that there are many other ways of continuing education. We still don't know whether best practices are really out there. We've seen many things that I outlined, and Gustavo also outlined in his presentation. And so education can continue, and we know how to ensure that it continues outside of the school context. But that requires not just, as I said, offsetting the burden on parents and others who might be able to take care of that, while we're able to guarantee that everyone's safety is covered as children return to school. It actually requires empowering and providing those resources so that all children can be equally included in any response. And so, there's a lot of debate at the moment on public health versus other rights, but I think they are equally compatible, and governments should not be saying that schools cannot reopen if they haven't actually done enough to consider how education can continue in the right way and in an equal manner. But we could discuss this for many, many hours, by the way.
Thank you, Ellen. As a final question, if you were to imagine that you had unlimited resources and in a few words could tell us what you would prioritize in your response, only a few words, and so that's a request. So please tell us in a few words, what would you do as your top priority?
Sorry,
shall I go first? Or Gustavo? No, Gustavo, please.
I have to think about it. I think it's hard to tell. Definitely the technology gap that some of us were referring earlier is more noticeable than ever, right? And so how to ensure that children, learners have access to and not only technology. I don't mean only a laptop or an app, whatever technology makes sense locally. Or even if that's text, but obviously in the context of the pandemic is challenging. To make sure that we keep promoting that learning that Helen was referring to in those notes, and how important it is to not stop in a way. But we also have to think about the context in which these families are, and there's all these issues related to caregiving. I struggle with the challenges of homeschooling, and I'm in a very privileged position because I can work from home and I don't have a livelihood challenge. I'm in great conditions, so I cannot think of, I do know how some of the families that are facing some of these challenges are. So it's a very complicated thing, but addressing some of the learning pieces, but also the conditions in which families are to promote learning matter.
Thanks, Gustavo. Ellen?
So as I said, building back better. I mean, I would stop governments from using the term leaving children behind, because you know, governments have an obligation, and it should be about including all children. But in the current crisis and in what happens next, it should be about prioritizing those groups of children that we have outlined in this webinar, and ensuring that any measures that they are taken are over-inclusive. So it's not just the average, as I said, it's actually reaching out and ensuring that all policies respond to those children who are most in need at the moment.
Thank you, Helen. You're muted.
Actually, yes. I am. I have actually very specific recommendations that have to do with perceptually enhanced textbooks in order to speed up automaticity, which I've been trying to explain and promote. There are many pilots that are underway. We can speed things up. And this is before the coronavirus. So much the worst. The children by now have lost 3 or 4 months of the school year. And it is possible to speed up this process. It's just that the textbooks in the world, the grade 1 books, and I really focus a lot on grade 1, but the automaticity issue is across all grades. Grade 1 is very inefficiently done. Textbooks are full of big pictures and very little text, so students cannot become automatic for years, even if they have the textbooks, which is why just having textbooks is not enough. They're likely to be the wrong textbooks. They're middle-class textbooks. So yes, the point is to expand provision of perceptually enhanced textbooks. A fairly simple instructional model for the teachers is necessary. Tons of practice, they need to be thick. Together with it, you need to have follow-up reading books in all languages and scripts that again have bigger and spacier letters than they do now. The picture size actually needs to be small because it takes up space. Sure, you can put all of this in ICTs and you can put all of these things in tablets, but the poor can only have access to paper, and that's much safer. There are all of these procurement issues. We have battled with these without reaching any conclusions of anything faster actions at the World Bank. And therefore, one of the things that you can do is pressure the World Bank and the USAIDs and all the Save the Children's and all that kind of stuff to actually put in place what cognitive science shows is necessary to acquire the reading fluency that will then carry the students to the higher levels necessary, and do so as fast as possible, rather than diddle around with economic analysis and big picture stuff and all of these things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody, for this critical conversation. The recording of this event will be available shortly on the COVID-19 and Justice Event Series website, which you can reach at tinyurl.com/COVID-19 Justice Series. You're also invited to join us tomorrow at the same time for another panel titled Rethinking Essential: Business, Work, and Human Rights in the COVID-19 Pandemic. And thanks again to our panelists, and please join me in thanking them.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. A pleasure.